Secretary Shalala, Governor Ridge, Senator Lieberman, and Senator Daschle. Thanks. It's really a privilege to be here and with you, Andrea Hall, to spend a few minutes with you. It's my understanding we're going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes of high-level remarks, and then we look forward to your comments and questions and going forward. Let me set the stage with just a couple of comments. Biodefense and protecting the American people from those biological threats is a priority for the Trump administration. The administration understands that biological risks are real and has prioritized that as a serious priority. Thanks for underlining the word priority. It's number 3 on your list. It ought to be at the top. So not only is it a priority at the Oval Office, but our Homeland Security Advisor, Mr. Tom Bossert, has made it a top priority. The folks on the Hill that are look at this as a priority, and we're keeping them posted. The bottom line is, and I think I alluded to this earlier, is that the commitment is to move this quickly, and I personally am trying to push this to the end of the year or early next year. But that's the window that we're shooting for, and we're keeping our legislators up to speed on that.
Good. Thank you, Governor.
And the intent of the administration is to look at a number of the priority strategies to make sure that they're integrated and they're complementary.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the endeavor, is to make sure that we are in sync with the national security priorities as well.
All the better.
Thank you. I have a substantive question, but before I
Is it?
You got it on? Very good.
Yep. Yeah, can you all hear? Is it coming across okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I hesitate to say it, but you're wired.
Very good. Very good. So, as I said, I've been a big fan of the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on biodefense since its inception, and I really am honored to be with you here today to share my perspective on these issues, and then certainly to take your questions. So, biodefense continues to be an area of focus for the subcommittee on emerging threats and capabilities, House Armed Services Committee, and in my role there as a ranking member of ETC, I've sought to elevate the conversation surrounding this issue and to promote sensible, robust national biodefense policies. This is an issue that we need to pay close attention to. So as we know, many state and non-state actors seek to develop, proliferate, acquire, and use weapons of mass destruction against our nation, against our service members, our allies, and certainly innocent civilians, both overseas and here at home. So that's why my friend and colleague Representative stop and think just for a moment before we act precipitously, and why I continue to fight against closing the center in the first place. So we must also strive to improve integration in order to achieve greater efficiencies. The biodefense enterprise is spread across a number of departments and agencies, I know, as you have heard and you know, which have different priorities that match their mission. While some fragmentation can be helpful, biosurveillance and countermeasures are certainly not the same functions, and a lack of holistic integration can lead to duplicative efforts or worse, capability gaps. So we cannot fall prey to jurisdictional squabbles, and ensuring that a whole-of-government approach drives investment and buy-in across the federal government. Now, I also believe that it's critical that we continue to include cybersecurity as a key component of our defense strategies, and apply cyber risk mitigation tools across the enterprise to include a biological defense. So I've often said that cybersecurity is the national security and economic security challenge of the 21st century, and that any future conflict will inevitably contain an element of cyber as a part of it. So this holds true for our biological, chemical, nuclear, and radiological defense as well. So my subcommittee evaluates these unique and dangerous threats regularly, and we understand how critical it is to have a coherent common sense strategy in place. This is why ETC stepped up oversight over the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program at the beginning of the Congress. Biological agents, once released, clearly know no boundaries. So improving our foreign partners' capabilities to secure and dispose of WMD materials is in everyone's best interest. So we must continue to push this dialogue forward, not just in the defense community, but also within Congress as well. So I believe that my colleagues understand the threats that we face today better than they did 10 years ago, but it is on us to further those discussions within Congress. It's asked for briefings from the defense and intelligence communities to stay on top of the threat, evaluate and debate the guidance and advice put before us by experts such as yourselves, and provide the resources necessary to keep our nation out of harm's way.
The great forward to, and which Governor Ridge contributed an excellent blurb to. The book is called Shall We Wake the President? And it lists a whole bunch of threats that presidents face and how presidents have reacted to them in history, but also how presidents should react going forward. It has policy suggestions. And of all the issues I talk about, where they would tell me things that would make your hair fall out, and in my case, much of it did. But it was terrifying to hear what some of the threats are that are out there. And perhaps I do, as one of the previous panelists suggested, sleep better at night not hearing those briefings regularly. But just because I'm not hearing them regularly doesn't mean that the threats aren't still there. So that is the overarching reason. But I want to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the concerns I have on this threat. Number one is, if you look at the bioterror aspect of it specifically, a concern I have is that we have people with intent to do harm. This is one of the things I used to hear about in the SCIF, but we know about it from public sources. ISIS, for example, had a captured laptop, and the laptop indicated that they had plans to try and weaponize plague. Now, I'm not that concerned about plague per se, because I think it could be addressed with antibiotics today. But if they're looking to weaponize pathogens, that is a problem. And we just saw in New York this week that they have the capability of taking people who are here and radicalizing them while they're here and getting them to do terrible things. And the person in New York rented a truck. But what if somebody was radicalized who works in a biological facility? So that is a concern. Another concern I have is that it's very hard to defend and very hard to detect. You can't see the pathogens. And what I did in my study of history is I found that in previous instances of what you could call biological attacks, so I looked at the attempt by German agents to infect American horses with glanders in World War I so that we couldn't use them in the cavalry. I looked at the Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh in Dallas, Oregon in the 1980s when they tried to poison salad bars with salmonella so that they could win a local election. And then obviously there was the anthrax attacks of 2001. In all of those cases, the threat was either not detected at the time, certainly not in the World War I situation, the Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh, we only found out about it because the people who were the perpetrators admitted it a year later. There was definitely illnesses going on in Dallas, but people didn't know what had happened until the perpetrators admitted it. And then with the anthrax attacks, we never definitively identified the culprit, although we think we did. The person who of interest committed suicide before being arrested. So this inability to detect these things in advance or to identify who is doing it is another concern that I have. The other problem that I worry about is the potentially devastating consequences. We've talked in this panel about the dark winter exercise that found that 1 million people would die in case of a major biological attack, and that we would only have that vaccine at the time for about 5% of the population. The NSC also did a study back in the Obama administration that found that such an attack would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and kill hundreds of thousands of people. So very, very significant dangers, and it's not just remote exercises or tabulations by people at tabletop exercises that tell you this. We've seen in our history some really problematic examples. One thing I talk about extensively in my book is the 1918 flu. It was not a biological attack, but it was a pathogen. 675,000 Americans died, perhaps as many 50 million died around the world. And what I found in my book is that President Wilson really did not stand up and do what needed to be done in that situation. Now, one of the themes of my book is that the expectations on presidents have significantly changed at the time. So there's a limit to how much blame you can put on someone 100 years ago when the expectations were so different. I talk about how in the 19th century, presidents, because of lack of communication, often didn't even know about disasters that were taking place. In 1811, there was an earthquake in Missouri, and President Madison was in charge at the time, and he didn't really know about the extent of the damage for 6 weeks. So what's he going to do at 6 weeks after finding out what the problems are? And so it's not like today where you have the immediacy of modern communications. It's also, there was not a constitutional expectation that presidents would get involved in these disasters. But over time, the expectation has shifted to the point now where we do expect the presidents to be involved. And so I would hope if something like the flu situation happened, we would respond better. Also, you had the Ebola situation in 2014. Fortunately, it didn't cause that many deaths, but it certainly caused a lot of panic, and a lot of the promises of the public health community that we could control Ebola and that it wouldn't spread person to person here in the U.S. were found to be not accurate. Now, in part because they didn't follow proper procedures. And again, it didn't spiral out of control, but there was a lot of panic about Ebola. And if there were a more intense situation, the panic would obviously be a lot worse. I also did a kind of intensive look at what would happen in some kind of attack in New York City. And I found that New York City was particularly vulnerable, not only because it has been the target of a large number of the terrorist attacks that we've seen in the U.S., or the terrorist attempts that we've seen in the U.S., including the attack this week, but also because it's, I think, uniquely a hard city to get a proper response in. 300 square miles, 5 large boroughs, 62 hospitals, 150 different languages. So it's very spread out. It's hard for the first responders to interact, but also because there's 240 skyscrapers in New York City. That's almost 2.5 as many times as many in Chicago. And one of the problems we know that terrorists face in trying to perpetrate a biological attack is the dispersal issue, that you could put something out there and the wind can take it and then it loses its effectiveness. But in a skyscraper, if you can get into the ventilation system, there are potentially thousands of people at risk. And we know there were 50,000 people in the towers at 9/11. Fortunately, most of them got out, but obviously, tragically, about 3,000 of them did not. So the skyscrapers are something that I worry about, and I know we've put more attention to looking at the ventilation systems, but it is, all you need is one to be vulnerable. So those are some of the problems as I see it, but I also think that we have some important tools, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I think presidential attention is an important tool. I think if a president focuses on something, he can move the government and break through those silos that Senator Daschle, you were complaining about rightly earlier, that these silos are hard and they're hard to break through, but I think presidential attention is one of the abilities, one of the tools we have to get through it. I also think that there are some structural issues we've talked about in terms of having some kind of unified budget. Having some point person, we suggested the vice president, but perhaps there are other ways to do it, as we heard about earlier. Having a better procurement system. I was encouraged by Admiral Zimmer, not just by what he said here, but what he said in the room privately. He said when he got this new job, he wanted us to guess, or he said, do you know what the first book I read after getting this appointment? And there was a pause, and I initially was hoping that he'd say, shall we wake the president? But he did not say that, but he did say the second best answer, which was the Blue Ribbon Study Panel's book that we put out about a year ago. And I was very encouraged with that, and he said he heavily marked it up. And so I think that's not only good news, but I think it really vindicates the work that we've been doing here, that we put a lot of thought into how to address these issues, and that people who are now in positions of power are reading that. So I think that's encouraging as well. I think we do need to focus on prioritization. There are obviously dozens of potentially dangerous pathogens, but we know, and you can't defend against them all, but we know that certain ones that are bigger dangers, and I think we need to focus on that. One concern I have had that I mentioned earlier in our private session is that we identified Ebola as a threat in 2001. And we also had NIH report positive trials of a vaccine in monkeys, also in 2001. Well, 2014 came around, and we didn't seem prepared, and we didn't have that vaccine ready. So I think when we identify the threats, we need to act on it and improve our procurement system so that we get the responses, the countermeasures ready at the appropriate time. Another concern I have is about distribution. I think we have an SNS, a Strategic National Stockpile. We spent $7 billion on it, about $500 million annually to maintain it. And it's very good at what it does. But what it does is it gets stuff within 24 hours, countermeasures within 24 hours, to a generalized location. And the distribution of the countermeasures to the individuals from that generalized location is up to the states and locals. And we know that there are variations between state and local, among state and locals about how good they are. We saw this recently in FEMA's responses to Hurricane Harvey and then Hurricane Maria. Texas is very good at its state homeland security response, and they were able to distribute materials. In Puerto Rico, it's just a much tougher situation, not just because of the lack of roads, not just because of the fact that it's an island and it's more remote, but the homeland security operation in Puerto Rico is just not as robust as that of, let's say, Texas or Florida. So there are state and local variations that we need to be aware of. On distribution, I think we need to be looking at more options. I know we've looked at postal in the past. There's the pod approach, the point of distribution, which works for many people, but you have to worry about people who are older or have disabilities who may not be able to reach that distribution point. I also think we need to partner more with the private sector on this. I think the private sector, in terms of distribution companies, vaccine companies, for example, know how to guard vaccines. They know how to maintain the proper temperatures, and then they know how to distribute it. And so I think we should work closely with the private sector to get that taken about. And then there are new innovations like drones that can deliver things to individuals at a relatively low cost in a particularly safe way. I mentioned the state and locals. I think we need close partnership with them, because if the states and locals don't do their job, the federal government can do a great job and it won't necessarily solve the problem, in large part because of distribution. But also, you look at a place like New York City, and I mentioned some of the concerns I have about New York City, and I do have some, but I also know that New York City is doing a tremendous job in preparing for these kinds of things. Not only does it have its own intelligence unit, which unfortunately it had to develop because the CIA would not share intelligence with New York on a timely basis, but in addition to the intelligence unit, it has a very active public health department that has done tabletop exercises, that has done distribution run-throughs, that knows how to get things to the people of the city should something bad happen. And so I'm encouraged by that. I'm not sure every other place is as effective. I look at the Washington Metro, for example, and I'm not even sure they can run the red line, let alone get things to where people need them at times. So I think the variation is an issue. And then there's individuals, and I think individuals have an important role to play. We talked when I was in the Bush administration about med kits, allowing people to purchase some kind of kit that could allow them to deal with some kind of outbreak. You could only use this in case of an outbreak and directed by a public health official. There was some resistance from the public health community on this, but I think it's something that's worth exploring. I think hygiene is important, having a family plan. Vaccines are important. I think people should take vaccines, and some of the vaccine hysteria is something that disturbs me. Social distancing is something that has been effective in certain cases. In fact, in the 1918 flu, Philadelphia and St. Louis, which were cities of comparable populations, St. Louis instituted social distancing to prevent that flu spreading. Philadelphia didn't, and St. Louis ended up with a death rate about 1/5 that of Philadelphia. So there are a number of tools we have in the toolbox, and I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure we use those tools. And in closing, I'm just reminded of the story of the pious but poor man who is asking the Lord for help and says, "Lord, Lord, can I please win the lottery? Can I please win the lottery?" And after multiple weeks of not winning the lottery, he begs the Lord. He says, "Lord, I've been a pious man my whole life. Why can't I ever win the lottery?" And the Lord's voice booms down and says, "Help me out, buy a ticket." Well, these tools are our ticket, and we should buy them. Thank you. Specific things in the book that I found problematic. Number one was this was called the Spanish flu, but it
Yeah.
did not originate in Spain. It actually originated in Kansas at one of the military bases. And it became apparent that the U.S. military transports that were taking American soldiers to fight in World War I across the Atlantic were grounds for spreading this disease. And it was spreading it among the soldiers themselves, but also among the people of Europe. I said 675,000 Americans died. The total number of American deaths in World War I was 116,000, so 6 times as many died from flu. But also, 43,000 of the American soldiers who died from flu. So it was a significant component of the military deaths. Anyway, it became apparent that the troop transports were spreading the disease, and Wilson was warned about this by his Navy doctor. There was a meeting in the White House where the guy who is now the equivalent of the Army Chief of Staff vociferously objected to this idea of stopping the troop transports, and Wilson acceded to his request, but kind of looked down afterwards and said a little depressing ditty that was said at the time about a little bird named Enza out flew the window and became influenza. So he knew that he was beaten, and he kind of knew that he was wrong, but he allowed this to go forward. And this was in October of 1918, 1 month before hostilities ended. And so it really wasn't that necessary to maintain the troop transports at that rate, and I think they could have done something to solve it there. The other thing was there was a committee on public integrity. It was basically a propaganda arm of the Wilson administration that was supposed to promote happy talk, focus all effort on winning the war, diminish talk about depressing subjects like the flu. And by not talking about it, I think the American people lost the ability to share strategies like this thing I was telling you about between Philadelphia and St. Louis. And so by having this kind of propaganda arm, and again, I recognize it was a different time, I think he minimized the cross-country communication that could have helped alleviate some of the issues there.
Okay.
And it is something I do look at a fair bit in the book. One of the things that I'm talking about, first of all, is making sure that we prioritize among what the disasters are. And I think that, frankly, we've spent too much time looking at how presidents respond to weather disasters. And I think we should kind of ratchet down presidential attention to weather.
Biodefense enterprise, and they have built a great track record of bringing products to market in the space. The third point I'll make is around regulatory science. We have seen challenges with Ebola, and we're now seeing challenges with Zika. I'm now the president of the vaccine business at Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and we are the only large company that has a contract with BARDA to produce a Zika vaccine. Now, Zika is
a phenomenon that makes the journey either short and almost effortless or impossible, and that factor is culture. I believe it was Peter Drucker, the guru of management, who said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And there are a number of cultures to be found in biodefense because it is so diverse. Consider and respect the culture challenges we face and as you design for an outcome. To be successful with biodefense strategy, I suggest the Blue Ribbon panel advocate for some type of culture planning too. In order to cross this divide from policy to results, from strategy to outcomes, it requires certain and extraordinary leadership, inspiring people, communities, and organizations so that they do what they would not normally do. Members of biodefense decision-making, because of the complexity and overlap of the issue, can never be completely handed back over to the individual departments and agencies, and will always need strong centralized leadership and management. I recognize that you as a panel have advocated for that centralized leadership, and from your earliest documents in recommending the Vice President fit this bill. And I have said to this panel in the past, I'm in agreement very much with that centralized leadership. I struggle with the Vice President being the best solution exclusively, though. From my experience and observations in federal service, leadership, wherever it's going to be located, must be connected to the budget process. I would suggest that the panel consider a specific design for leadership here, because this goes to successful implementation. I submit that biodefense leadership and management must follow the money and be ready to measure outcomes in order to make effective accomplishments and move forward. Whatever centralized leadership structure exists or is created by directive and or strategy, I believe for a successful implementation, the M has to be added back into OMB. I suggest a unique and a new role, or roles perhaps, to be created and adapted to the Office of Management and Budget. For instance, placement of a biodefense czar-like director position attached to the director's office, accompanied by a career executive director, both of which are able to command the authority and effectively crosswalk the biodefense issues between the various assistant directors and their areas of specializations, the PADs and the DADs. And as a custom within OMB, the finalized milestones and benchmarks established to develop and attain an increasing level of maturity and complexity over time. The Office of Management and Budget is the correct place to accomplish this goal for the United States government. Use the budget process to enforce the design for outcome. Leadership for biodefense, in order to be successful, has to involve the budget. Establishing, achieving, maintaining some quality standard for biodefense preparedness, especially in my mission area or my previous mission area, agri-defense, it has been elusive. I am a believer in looking to history or comparable situations from which to learn. I draw your attention to the nuclear power industry. I personally live within a 10-mile potential impact zone of a nuclear reactor. And I also know there are nearly 100 reactors across the United States. So rarely there has been an incident from these energy sources. And if you think about it, that community, the nuclear power community, cannot prepare themselves with real life incidents or live fire practice. They use simulations and measure their capabilities. They ready themselves by use of periodic, ongoing, progressive outcome simulations to understand, teach preparedness, and learn pathways to mitigation. They do this so that I can live 8 miles away from 3 reactors in that plant, and I don't worry. Unfortunately, my electric bill is the same as yours probably. The communities and the state and the federal authorities and the plants take this seriously, evaluate them themselves every couple of years. It's a mandatory thing. Every couple of years, they're being held accountable to their simulation results. The centralized leadership and authority for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in partnership with FEMA and the state emergency management agencies, direct all this. Simulation testing and learning is increasingly being used in the military, in industry, and in other government agencies. Exercises have been used to a certain degree in the biodefense arena, both the human and the animal. Bio-events have been held, but never to the degree or the sophistication and ongoing seriousness that the nuclear power industry does. There may be something here for biodefense to learn and emulate. I suggest that if biodefense management embrace the art of simulation as a methodology to measure and improve, to be developed and refined as a tool to pursue excellence and outcomes over time, and not one-off games occasionally performed and played, we would see growth in confidence with part of our biodefense preparedness spectrum, the preparedness, response, recovery portions. Thinking differently is the beginning of innovation. We are now approaching a 14-year anniversary since those earliest biodefense policies and directives were created. It is time for a renaissance in biodefense thinking, in particular in the agri-defense side. I believe that we can accomplish this biodefense differently. I believe real biodefense is closer to the people than the government. So how do we get closer to the people? I suggest our organizational structures dedicated to vigilance and solutions should reflect an inclination toward the community. All the same actors are required: the current diverse set of federal departments and agencies, the states, the frontline authorities where the real incidents happen and unfold, and where they're dealt with, as well as the private sector and individuals too. If we consider the biodefense landscape of agriculture and food and ecosystem services and a national economy situation, the focus on the relationship between the states and the federal entity, in that relationship, states own agriculture. The states are closer to the people, the committees, and the solutions. The federal is an interstate coordinator, international representative, and a defender. If there is a bioincident in a state, it is the state's hands that get dirty. The federal shows up with the money if they're asked, and they're always asked. And if the incident proves to be a bioterror, then the federal becomes predominant. In this relationship, the states are in many ways the first-line customer of biodefense implementation plans. And they are often the sentinels, responders, keepers, and doers of all these federal policies as they're drafted. How might these first-order customers, the states, be empowered to assist in driving ideas, accountability, and outcomes? Well, this suggestion I'm going to make might be and probably is beyond the scope of the executive branch national biodefense strategy all by itself, or its implementation plan by itself. I believe the states, if they were brought together as compacts, encompassing regions and challenged to be part of the strategy and solutions, as well as a source of accountability, just because they're customers, the federal biodefense strategy and implementation would have more life to it. By comparison, to paint my picture, as someone who lives 8 miles away from a nuclear reactor, I am always interested that the reactor safety and security is done well. So in sum, biodefense, after 16 years since we started, I'm hopeful that we are on a new era for it, and of coordination and institutionalization of certain design structures. Establish and stabilize White House leadership and management. I didn't talk about this today, but to accomplish integrated, expanding horizon capabilities that involve anticipation and awareness in the morning. Embrace simulation as a tool to teach, to measure, to evolve. Empower and establish partnership equilibrium between communities, state, federal, and private. I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Enterprise. On top of that, DHS has had a very small footprint in this particular area since its inception, with the finally setting up of an Office of Health Affairs in 2006. But again, even with a very small footprint. As a result of this, the Homeland Security Council stepped up and institutionalized biodefense leadership in the White House in the form of a presidential biodefense advisor in the HSC, and importantly, a staff to work with that biodefense advisor in order to coordinate and implement strategy and planning and policy that could be coordinated. No one can get a meeting put together like a presidential advisor. People show up, and people show up who can actually make a difference. The involvement of the White House, it enabled prioritization. It enabled the involvement of OMB that Dr. Mann mentioned. The White House can go to congressional leadership without actually having to negotiate 89 different congressional committees to get something done. And it can task the departments, most importantly. And this sort of tasking is going to be necessary if an implementation of a national strategy is to be successful. So I want to echo something that Kurt said. It almost doesn't matter where it is in the White House, if it's in the national security staff close to the director, or if it's in the vice president's office. But I want to compliment you all for taking this on. The WMD Commission also talked about this. But sadly, during the last administration, that level of attention inside the White House has been lacking. We've had numerous national strategies for this and that, and I want to go back to HSPD 9 and 10 as being pretty good foundational documents. And whether it's agro defense and HSPD 9 or biodefense HSPD 10, They were good starting points, but the momentum has in fact been lost. But the pillars of HSPD 10 of threat awareness and prevention and protection, surveillance and detection, and response and recovery offer a pretty good architecture and framework for moving forward. But we need more than a strategy. We need an implementation plan with a cascade of assignments and resources that last longer than a political cycle. To the extent possible, obviously, it would be apolitical. It's really everyone's business, and not just human health, not just protecting people, but also veterinary and animal concerns, food safety, food security, environmental impacts, which obviously have their own impacts on both human and animal health, as well as water and food security. So I will zoom to the end here to allow you some time to reflect, but I have sort of four broad areas in which I would recommend that the panel consider advising the White House on this issue. Number one is leadership. Biodefense in this country has to have leadership within the White House with gravitas, scientific basis, vision, and operational experience. And likewise, that leadership has to exist in the departments and agencies that interact with this biodefense advisor. I was very inexperienced in this issue when I took on the job of Chief Medical Officer in the department. And it took a long time, frankly, to gear up. I would encourage the White House Personnel Office to make sure that the appointments that are made to these biodefense relevant positions in the agencies are selected with great care and with a minimum of political consideration. Number two, as I said, we cannot stop with the strategy. We desperately need an implementation plan with the authorities, the personnel, and the budget in order to see through to completion those sub-objectives that Admiral Zimmer mentioned earlier today. And we have to get back to the national response framework where we talk about planning, training, equipping, exercising, leading back to the plan. Number three, to make sure that that equip part is part of an acquisitions system that succeeds political cycles. Going back to Kurt's outcome-driven design. When the requirement for a radar evading aircraft was made, no one expected that to be done in 2 years or 4 years. It was part of an acquisition strategy with an outcome at the end, inviting different players and finally narrowing it down to getting the job done. We have to have that same sort of approach to acquisitions in the biodefense realm. And this is true not just for medical countermeasures, but for every capability that is necessary all the way down to the states and locals. And number four is the segue into that is
cultures at play in some ways. You mentioned the word culture management, I think, or the term culture management, and then moved off without defining what that was. Do you have any thoughts? Is there a secret sauce here that we can apply, or is there a way we take that issue head on to try to deal with it?
I don't proclaim to be an expert in this area, but it is talked about in leadership and management at the academic level and within business, in the business world, about culture planning and the importance of it, because all your best ideas can go to naught if you approach a change. It's part of change management, which is becoming more and more of a buzzword too now. No, I do not have any secret sauces. What little I do know is probably just what I've learned by experience, and that by being a student of human behavior and watching people as to what they do and what makes them tick, and trying to appeal to that side personally. And that's how I've been successful in my leadership. I think if you do, whatever the magic is here, but I think culture planning, you have to go to every one of these silos or agencies, and they have a right to their culture too, and you have to respect it. And I think that's the first step, is culture planning means you respect the persons that you're maybe trying to help along or change. And they have other jobs. They had previous jobs before biodefense wasn't thought about seriously. Their jobs are driven by statute to solve other problems. I know in the Department of Agriculture, this is a nuisance sometimes, this thing called biodefense. They have other things with very little money to do that they're being told to do by Congress. Again, some cultures are so hard to break in a bureaucracy in our federal system here because they're protected by committees on the Hill, because that culture is there also. And so my secret sauce, if you will, is to respect that culture first, and then you have to appeal to their, as the overused term, better angels.
Right, and I think, just to follow up, I mean, obviously, that's one of the main functions.
I'll go ahead. That's a very good question, and it's a difficult thing to wrap my mind around. But I think that a difference, because I happened to be sitting as a special assistant to a secretary at the time when the planes flew into our buildings. And then all of a sudden, within so many hours, I had a top secret clearance, and I was designated the director of all things that we were going to do for defense on the homeland here for that particular department. And I think what's been it's not the right use of the word, but what is different now than then is we were starting completely from scratch, and people couldn't get their mind around what this was, what the threat was, and what was this thing that the White House was trying to do called Homeland Security. So there was a certain amount of pushback, and I don't know if it was premeditated, orneriness, but it was, I don't understand this. I don't know what we're doing. I think today, if the same thing happened, while there may not be specific institutions built into the system completely yet, there is enough of a memory, a muscle memory, if you will, that we would probably achieve some sort of response quicker, or our cultures would be melded into one for a common purpose more. I think that might be the difference in my mind. Is in 2001, we didn't know what to do, and people didn't know what to do. In 2018 or 17, I think we would naturally move forward faster.
I guess I would just ask though, Kurt.
Today, it still would be the president. Anytime you have something of this magnitude, it has to be the president. Now, they may have a much more robust infrastructure around them. But I thought you were talking, excuse me.
No, I was referring to both, but I just, on that.
We're not perfect, but we'd be much more nimble-footed now than we were then.
I would like to agree with that as well, Senator Daschle, and we have institutions now that we did not have back then. We do have functioning systems in place. My fear is that unlike a natural disaster where we have really good weather predictions and so forth, we are way behind in detection of something once it has occurred. We do not have clinical surveillance systems adequately set up in order to determine when we are in the middle of, or when we're at the beginning of an outbreak, or the middle for that matter. We have ancient technology for environmental detection for which there's been no tangible improvement since the system started in February 2003. So my concern is that we are going to be, if there's an intentional release of an agent, we will be in the middle of it with the disaster already occurring. Just to lay the scenario out, let's just say that there's an aerosolization of any size in a major city. The people who have the largest exposure, and I have a particular agent in mind, will consume the resources of the health institutions first, and they will not be salvageable. To then get countermeasures, antibiotics into the bodies of people who are in that penumbra of treatable within some time frame, which is of course altered if it's not a naturally occurring outbreak, is we're relying on institutions that have not been proven and frankly not tested in quite a long time, but for which we have systems that are nominally in place. that's it's a large concern. Unfortunately, those people are also going to get sick, and the resources to take care of them are also going to be consumed by group number one. So we have not thought through this adequately right now. There is science that has frankly not been dealt with because of earlier assumptions that we made in our own threat assessment. I would say that we are better because we have institutions, but we are still way behind where we need to be.
Yeah, I would agree with that bottom line. I think we are, and I'm a little further away from actual direct service. So this is my assessment from the outside, is that we have had a number of opportunities to learn and relearn that when there is a threat to human health, that agencies beyond human health agencies have to be a part of the response. And this was one of the key learnings from pandemic preparedness, that there were 16 different departments and agencies that had to be a part of pandemic preparedness. And so I think that recognition alone helps to ensure that in the coordination bodies that we have the right parties around the table at the federal level. Where I become concerned is that the interface between the feds and state and locals is the quality of that interface and coordination is going to vary from locality to locality, and you can't test every one of those interfaces against every scenario. And that's where you need to have very strong leadership and have just-in-time kind of assemblage of these mechanisms of working with that particular set of parties at the state and local level in a constructive way that gets a response off the ground and running. And that's just a very tough nut to crack.
Thank you.
I would say that that's a symptom of a broader problem, which is a lack of coordination between certain activities in the government that center on biodefense. There are different pockets of these activities.
Yeah.
There isn't sufficient communication and coordination, and having a single budget is a first step to cleaning that up. But this gets into the silo issue that we discussed previously and the desire of many to make sure that they protect their domain and their budgets and so on, and that needs to be overcome.
That's the ultimate.
Because people are going to groan, but we heard this as a policy objective for national intelligence with the creation of the ODNI.
Right.
That the different intelligence agencies and intelligence agencies within departments had an uncoordinated funding stream. I don't know how this has worked, but the idea of consolidating funding over an enterprise certainly makes sense in the business world, and it seems to me that it might make sense to have some sort of central budgeting, some place where it all gathers. I think back to the pandemic issue of 2005, and there wasn't money to deal with this, and so what happened is you all approved a $7.1 billion supplemental to deal with what was determined to be sufficient imminent danger that we needed to do something to get vaccines back into this country and to strengthen public health infrastructure. And that was presidential leadership and the leadership of Secretary Leavitt. So it would seem to me to be much better to have a centralized budget authority somewhere. I don't do that sort of work, so I can't really say where, but to your point, Senator Lieberman, it certainly would make sense. The other rather obvious point I would make is that the silos partially exist because of the budget lines. So when there's a project BioShield with bunches of billions of dollars to medical countermeasure creation, it's unlikely that HHS is going to want to share authority over that money because it's in their budget line. It's just the way things are. We saw after Katrina hit that immediately a lot of the resources that had been transferred into DHS were then pulled out of DHS back to their original agencies. So it's natural human behavior for the budget lines to determine where these activities sit without an enterprise approach.